So I'm going to invite Professor Sardin Marke here and our conference chair, Dr. Reggie Simo, for the next segment in conversation with Keynote. This will just give us an opportunity to ask Professor Sardin some questions. He has left us with a lot to think about. Perhaps in asking him questions, he will also give us some answers. So let's welcome them. Please, let's put our hands together for them.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Susie. Thanks, Professor Taudin, for the for the thought-provoking keynote. I think there are many people here bowling, like want to ask you questions about a follow-up question about the keynote address. I hope that we will have time enough to take all the questions. I can see faces here already wondering. So before I give the floor the opportunity to ask you a question, I will first start where you ended by asking us to like reflect. There is no idea which is not. I mean, academic freedom, right? That's why you ended your speech by requesting us to somehow not refrain from engaging in a thought-provoking way in the EFTA implementation. So my question to you, or again, it's my perspective of the EFCFT and what you discussed, this what you introduced. Do you think that the way in which the EFCFTA, I think you already gave your opinion about that, but I would like you to expand on some of these issues, especially when you mention inclusivity and the fact that it should be people-centered. Do you think that there has been enough in terms of text? Because again, the way it's implemented is different from how it is devised. Do you think that the text alone, at this point, have ingredients to have that inclusivity operational?
Oh, thank you. I'm used to ask people questions. Now I'm at the center of the receiving side. It's an interesting question, Doc. The concept of inclusivity is very broad and it's multifaceted. And at no point I expect the agreement, the CFTA, to have all the variables necessary for inclusivity. But looking at the text, and particularly the protocol, I would say more should be done in terms of engagement of local Africans. And we're talking there, about them at different levels. The level small, medium size, large enterprises, individual, freelance. Because I think the big problem which we are not able to, we have not been able to address, we have not mapped up in terms of what products do we consider to be or should be the subjects of CFTA. By products, I'm referring to both goods and services. The sectoral distribution, because the more we expand various sectors that are subject to CFTA, the more inclusive it becomes. But as we talk about inclusiveness, we have what we call accidental exclusion of others through regulatory process. And here I would like to talk about special groups, which should be considered as part and parcel with inclusivity agenda. Within AU, there is a broad framework in terms of sustainable and inclusive development, touching special groups like gender, those with the special needs in terms of accessibility to services. So in my view, the CFTA should we should do more in the context of CFTA in terms of extracting from the main theme, main objective of CFTA, and identify specific disadvantaged groups whom we feel they need special attention before they are considered to be fully equipped to compete at the continental level, and devise specific strategies to build capacity to them. So if that component is included, specifically tailored, specifically marshaled to trade context, I think we can see more positive effect in terms of inclusivity within the CFTA. Because just having a word within the text that development should be inclusive is not enough without detailing and appreciating the context and how you bring those who feel excluded to participate within the broader supply chain equation. So if that can be done to extract from the main text, from the broad objective of the agreement, and identify specific action points which are needed. We have got to appreciate also cultural differences may have impact in this regard. There are certain societies which by nature, certain groups are excluded, or they feel so. So engagement beyond the trade text, we need also to look at the cultural emancipation and progressive, which need to be done. So what I would say, we need to have a more detailed, specific extract within the context of the agreement so that we can have specific intervention in that respect.
Thank you very much. And actually, I think you already answered some of the question, a follow-up question I already had. Because again, in terms of inclusivity in the AfCFTA, and we're mentioning the fact that the agreement is actually still being implemented, or at least partially implemented, or has started being implemented under the Guided Trade Initiative, which is an initiative that actually matches traders. And in that matching of traders across the border, there are some of them that will be left out. I mean, those that are not informal traders, I will be left out of that particular matching of traders, because again, they are not counted yet as participant. So, and I think you mentioned that some traders or some participants will be left out, and these are the people that can be left out at the moment, because again, the rules don't take into account what they are actually doing in terms of participating in the whole continental market. Now, next to that question is the fact that you also said that there may be controversies in the ways in which rules are devised and implemented. Now, you mentioned some action plans, which for the strategy on industrial policy in the AfCFTA in Africa. And one of the pillars that you highlighted was the industrial policies and the sustainable development. I was wondering to what extent these two goals can be contradictory at some point, bearing in mind that there is, at the moment in the world, many countries are resorting to green industrial policies. And because of these green industrial policies, some African countries are actually opposing, or at least they don't feel comfortable engaging with these green industrial policies. Meanwhile, in Africa, there are expectations that the industrial policies which they want to pursue should also be green, or at least to pursue sustainable development. Where do you see the AfCFTA or African countries moving along with this kind of, I would say, having two feet in the international global economic law governance in that regard?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and that's a kind of controversy which is facing, I think, not only Africa but across the continent. How do you balance industrial development with environmental protection? Because most of the industrial development initiatives would inevitably involve what we call disruptive technology to the environment. But at the same time, when you talk about sustainability, we want to engage in development initiatives, apply techniques that consider the future generation in terms of preservation of environment and natural resources. So how do you balance? It's a complex and a complicated equation. I may not have a direct answer, but what we see now and what we should appreciate, that industrial development does not or should not necessarily mean degradation of environment. We have seen even at the global landscape the move for green technologies. Nowadays, we have seen also financial institutions offering what we call special green bonds, supporting industrial or projects which are sensitive, conscious to the environmental protection, and they attract lesser interest rate because they are green projects. So I think for the future generation, we are also the beneficiary of the preservations which was done in the environment of our ancestors. They used traditional means to keep the environment, and that's why we stand here to benefit. So we should not operate like we don't care about the future generation. I think this should go part and parcel in the sense that we should encourage what we call green technology, green industrial projects. And it's interesting to see financial institutions. I don't know in other jurisdictions, but here in Tanzania, 2 major banks have already launched what we call the green bonds. And these are the funds which are raised specifically to support green projects, industrial projects which are conscious of environmental preservation. So the two can go together. I know it's a tough question in terms of how do you balance the numbers, but we see also the carbon trade, that countries are now buying oxygen, carbon, through this global carbon trade. So as a continent, we should treasure the environment because this places Africa in a more unique position. I've mentioned about the genetic resources. We cannot sustain our unique position in terms of having genetic resources without having a defined concrete strategy to protect environment. So in my view, the two can go together. It all goes how do you balance the two. Of course, you have to suffer in some point in terms of not able to use technologies which maybe are cheap or in the public domain, but as long as they disrupt environment, I think we should also consider an option, alternative, having a green technology in that respect.
Thanks very much. So my last question before I give the microphone to the floor. Let me now proceed where you start. You started with the pre-independence policies. So I was just wondering, since the AfCFTA somehow adopted some of this policy in its field, in the building of the African market, meanwhile, some of these rules were devised when these countries were still colonies, and they have been challenging some of these rules, the existence of these rules in, let's say, for the WTO, or at least trying to make sure that the rules actually take into account their disadvantaged position. What is your view on this? The fact that still, even today, they still replicate these neoliberal policies, which they actually oppose or somehow oppose at the global level.
Thank you. I think that tells us the importance of African Renaissance. When you talk about the Pan-Africanism, can we develop our own narrative? Because the economic pattern we have in Africa, literally we take trouble to appreciate that this was determined through colonial presence. In terms of our competitive advantage. We consider we are competitive in certain area because that's what we have been told or we have inherited. But it's important to revisit in terms of engaging with what we call soul-searching questions. Are we competitive only in the areas which we have inherited? The pattern of economies, setups, strength, largely depends on the colonial history. So this is an area which we need economists, we need industrialists, we need legal minds to redefine and also appreciate the competitive advantage which Africa is having beyond what was determined by colonial powers. If we are able to do that, I think we'll be able to take full advantage of the potentials which are currently existing in Africa. I can give an example of Tanzania that interestingly, we were under part of Tanzania under Arab domination of Arabs, part of Tanzania were under domination of Europeans. Obviously, Europeans would prefer areas which the weather is not hot. So even the education pattern, you also follow the same pattern up to now, despite the 50 plus years of independence. We need engage on these 60 plus years of independence in Tanzania, at least to reformulate our own setup. We have enough experts. We have enough information. People can engage, can interrogate so that we can come up with our own solution. We may rely on information we receive from the previous colonial powers, but we need at least an African theme and a narrative that reflects the context of Africa. That's what I said in terms of focusing on context instead of content.
Yeah. Okay, I will now invite questions from the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to first say my name is Wilfred Mutubwa from Nairobi, Mount Kenya University. And I want to say thank you very much, Prof, for a very, very incisive discussion. We appreciate. I have three very quick questions. Question number one, and I am happy that you alluded to the...
But please stick to one.
Okay, I will try and combine the questions. Now, I want to begin by saying, listening to you and having listened to many people speak about the Continental Free Trade Area, and you spoke about being bold to say sometimes when an idea is unpopular. Don't you think that now we are going towards 7 years of this Continental Free Trade Area? If we do an introspective analysis of what we have achieved, look, Africa continental integration is now close to 60 years from the OAU until today, from the history you've given us. European integration is about 70 years. Look at where they are. Look at where we are. Is it possible to say that, in fact, suggesting that integration is the panacea, it is the remedy for our problems, is actually perhaps something that we got wrong? In fact, we were told foreign direct investment is the answer to your problems. Now we are being told the answer to your problems is integration. We don't know what we will be told next, because debt was another one. And we keep on, and then there is now climate and climate financing. So we keep on recalibrating the things that we think will take us out of this problem, and we don't seem to get out. I want to ask your view. Africa as it is today, trading among itself by a 15%, a mere 15%. Sometimes it's very interesting when you see a president visiting another country in Africa, and they say the trade between our state countries is 1 billion Kenya shillings, less than what it has cost the president to travel there. So you wonder exactly what is this trade that we are talking about between people who produce the same goods, who import 90% of what they use from Europe and China. So they actually basically produce agricultural goods, which they consume at a subsistence level, and they are purporting to say they want to spur trade between themselves. Trade in what? Because number one, these people don't produce anything that they can export. Because the onions you're talking about, we import onions from Tanzania and tomatoes, but we also produce tomatoes and onions. So the question is, as it sits today, whether we speak about integration in Africa, do we really have the capacity to trade between ourselves? Because the challenge we have is, in my view, twofold. The right to movement in Africa is a big problem in Africa because, you go to Europe, you will find Europeans are given free entry. If you have a European passport, you actually don't have to line up. If you come to Kenya, the longest line entering Kenya is for Kenyan passport holders. They are the longest line, the longest queue. You will find a European going to the faster queue because the non-citizens take a shorter route. So the first problem is free movement. You're not going to trade if you're not having free movement because most of the African trade is done locally. So I wanted to ask, and by the way, only one man got an African passport,
Yes,
the then
please,
president.
Wilfred, please ask the
Yes,
question.
let me just say this.
Yeah.
Do you think that our problem is really the system, the framework which we keep speaking about, or are they those fundamentals you spoke about? Second, last question.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take some more, another question. Yeah, two more questions. Professor.
So thank you very much. I'll be very quick since I know we don't have a lot of time. I mean, I wish I had you as my professor as an undergraduate. And this was really amazing. And so I just wanted to say very quickly that there is a counterpart to your paper written by Dr. Debola. It's called Mapping Africa's IP Regime Complexes Towards an African-Centered IP Protocol. And it's been published in the African Journal of International Economic Law. It is open access. I think I'm kindly and humbly suggesting your article belongs there before it comes out in the book so that it's available to the world. And my only very quick question was to suggest perhaps with the example you gave of the differences in the IP, the trademark between Rwanda and Uganda, do you think that if a reference had been filed from the... is that Harrison laughing? I knew that this would trigger Harrison. Because it's also about educating another constituency, which is us, the lawyers, the domestic lawyers. If a reference had been filed to the East African Court of Justice to interpret the question in light of the EAC rules, would that have helped? Is that a possible way of thinking about how to resolve a situation like that? And here, I was speaking to some of the students here who are lawyers in law firms, and they're looking for things like this to do. So, just a question. I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. So my question is about franchising. You mentioned franchising, and I was struggling to see if you were pro-franchising or against franchising. So do you not think that franchising is a model that we can adapt on the continent with respect to trade, especially for small and medium enterprises on the continent?
Okay, you will answer the three questions, and we will take another round of questions if you have time.
Thank you. Good questions. The best way out is to say, I'll go and do further research. Okay, let me try to respond, starting with my brother there, Wilfred. It's a good question. I think these are the issues which I pointed out in terms of are we ready for tapping the free market in terms of benefiting. But you have raised a very important question, whether the integration is a solution or is a curse for Africa. I would say we should embrace integration. But how do we do that matters a lot. It has to be progressive, appreciating all the necessary stages that will create an effective integration. It's not something which you wake up in the morning and say, okay, can we sit together, then trade together? You know, this goes beyond transactional issues. It's relational. How do we appreciate each other? How do we How are we connected? And I would like to remind you the discussion between Mwalimu Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, just early 1960s, where they said, if Africa do not unite politically now, it will be very difficult down the line to unite economically or politically. Because what? People have already tasted the honey. How do you tell a president of country X who has been there for 30 plus years, you say, okay, can you now relinquish? Then we have, these issues. And in the process, we also have created what we call nationalistic spirit. When we are, as Africans, we pretend to be one. It's against the rest. But when the two Africans meet, then we start. We know the problems in other countries where they chase away their fellow Africans. So these are the issues which should go beyond the letters. So it's the question of appreciating the connectivity, the appreciation of us as brothers and sisters. Now that takes time in terms of appreciating that, okay, we can sit together, we can support each other. So that is, those are the issues which I think I mentioned, that we need to have progressive integration in terms of the bit by bit. If we start with like a boom decision that, okay, we have this, now goods can move from Nigeria to Tanzania or Nigeria, do we have the necessary prerequisites? Number two is a question of capacity you have mentioned. That's the example which I've given, that we do not have the capacity. We pretend to think that we have the capacity to manufacture and supply in African market. But in actual sense, if we quantify, if we break it down, we'll come to realize we are not able to do that. And that's why I gave you an example of Bill Gates moving into agricultural investments, having a potato farm, big, so big that you can see it from outer space, cameras. But look at African farmers in patches, small, more or less of subsistence. But at the same time, we consider to be ready for the continental market. So these are the issues which I thought we need to interrogate when I said we need to map up production and supply capacity of Africa. Once we are able to do that, I think we can see the benefits. We cannot go back and start afresh because the political independence and nationalism has already built a lot of roots. But progressively, maybe when we engage, we'll come to a point where we appreciate that we can see it as brothers and connect and trade in the process. Professor Gathi, I take it, subject to a reservation, that the EAC court has also a very defined structure of jurisdiction. Maybe we need to revisit also the jurisdiction component of what matters can be referred to there in terms of the guidance, and more important, how binding that should be. What we've been proposing as experts, I'm engaged with the EAC to formulate the IP strategy for East Africa. We're proposing, can we have at least a single common office where registrars of IP across East Africa can have a single reference in terms of checking new registrations. In terms of existing registrations, we need to sort out how we are going to handle. Are we going to allow concurrent existence in the same market, subject to differentiations? Because these are the problems which will also come under the continental free trade area, because I'm very much assured that there intellectual property in Kenya or Tanzania which are owned by different proprietors when you go to other African countries. And in terms of being more proactive and more ambitious in registration of these important assets for trade, like intellectual property. 2 years ago, I went through the data in terms of applicants in Africa. I normally attend the network meeting with Adams and Adams in South Africa, where they point out the filings in Africa. You come to realize those from Africans are less than 10%. in terms of total filings, trademarks and patents. So the argument which I was driving there is that these are matter of trade. And we're talking about market control because intellectual property are trade monopolistic tools. So we have to look at it and also engage and formulate a strategy in order for Africans to be, not to be spectators, rather effective participants. Finally, franchising, pro or against. I pointed out it in the context of why should we help our traders to appreciate their distinctive brands, that down the line they may be able not only to sell the actual products, but it transacts a brand and get revenue out of a brand. And this is the beauty of intellectual property in a trade. You have your phone, right? Mobile phone. Normally I ask people, what did you pay when you bought this? Mine is Samsung. So did I buy Samsung? Samsung is not mine. It's a brand. So what did I pay? The software in it, they are not mine. So what did I pay for? What do you own in your phone? Can you sell Samsung brand? You can't. Can you sell the software which are the operational gadgets of the phone? Can you sell to a third party? You can't. So this is what we call value separation, separability, which is facilitated by intellectual property, that you are able now to deal with the physical aspect independent from the non-physical aspect of it. You sell the physical and you keep the non-physical. And what we add in what we call value chain. There you don't get money not only based on the physical part of it, but the non-physical. And when you check on the current trade, what we call portfolio, you come to realize most companies are making out of a lot of money, not from selling of the physical things, rather the non-physical part of it, the licensing of software, stuff like that. So franchise is something commendable, and we can also adopt an appropriate policy to help even SMEs to make sure that they monitor their brands very closely, they nurture it, they protect such that they achieve a level where the brand is distinctive. It becomes what we call a domestic terminology. You buy a product before you reach to the supermarket or to the mall. How that happens? We normally make a decision to buy a product, a brand, when you are sitting at home, before you go to the actual market. And that is a huge investment for any business. And that's we talk about the power of brand, and consequently, when you talk about the franchise deals, which is a big now trade when it comes to service industry.
Thanks, Prof. Wow, that's been very interesting. Let's take another round of questions. Keep your questions short, so that we have time to answer them. Yeah, I am reminded of implementing gender balance and inclusivity.
Thank you, Prof, for the excellent keynote. My name is Ashimizo Afadame. I'm interested in the conversation. We've mentioned three things which I want to just merge together as lawyers and ask a question. You talked about engaging with the economics. You talked about connection with private sector in a way by mapping supply and production capacity. So if you merge all these three together, how do you think as a network we can actually make a difference by engaging with the private sector? So our work actually goes beyond the rhetorics and the academic conversation that we have here, and as a network, we can begin to engage with the private sector to enable them scale and benefit from the provisions of the AfCFTA. Thank you.
So you have departed from the gender issue.
Oh, there's a lady behind.
Prof, thank you very much for your lecture. My question really builds off from one of your interventions you made the point that the AfCFTA should be understood within the context of the political and legal institutions that were formed during post-independence. So I wanted to follow up by recalling the work of the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, who built, or at least drew substantially from that work in thinking about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in it, she emphasized that any development framework that doesn't address race explicitly runs the risk of naturalizing racial inequality, by rendering them conceptually invisible, by producing new terms which don't call immediately the colonial injustices of the past. And I think I might be wrong, but as far as I know, the AfCFTA makes no explicit mention of race. And in regards to its own observation of Agenda 63, as far as I know, Agenda 63 itself makes no mention of race explicitly. To my knowledge, the only time race is mentioned is in relation to black and white rhinos, in biodiversity. So, Prof, I wanted to know, what do you think about those limitations about, the AFC FTA is an emancipatory project? Thanks.
Prof, I have a question that might be a follow-up from Dr. Mutubo's question. While you were speaking, I noted down that you mentioned a lot of harmonization that needs to be done in Africa towards continental integration. You mentioned trade policies, education, intellectual property, there is Rex there are tax policies. And I was just wondering, I'm writing a paper on harmonization of quality assurance in education, higher education. And in my head, I was asking myself, is this a good research paper? Is it a dissertation? Is it just an academic paper? Do you think Africa is headed towards a place where we can say now we have one Africa, one policy, there is unity? Or we are all obsessed? When I say we, I mean African countries. Are we obsessed with sovereignty too much that we don't want to relinquish some of that to allow for continental integration? Do you think there's a feasible or a pragmatic approach towards relinquishing some of sovereignty, some of Africa's sovereignty? Thank you.
Yeah, let's take the final question, and please keep it very, very, very short.
Okay, I'll try not to ramble. So, Professor, my question departs a bit from, I guess, the text of the law. During your keynote, I couldn't help but wonder. To me, it seems like you kept coming back to it, but of course, it might be confirmation bias because it's something I've been thinking about even before, and that's this specific aspect of narrative building that you mentioned, and you spoke about discourse, allowing it to naturally take place through discourse. And I couldn't help but wonder, how exactly do you think that discourse could happen, considering the African Continental Free Trade Area, and to be fair, all other regional integration institutions are creatures of international law. And international law is a priori very statist. It's very statist. So how would those discourses happen? And if those discourses happened on this other aspect of what Mazrui calls Africa as a continent of continents, then if, say, somehow, some way, the first question of getting that discourse to happen, how would we then achieve harmonized phenomenology, philosophy, mental models, I call them, mental models underlying everything in regional integration in Africa and free trade in the continent?
Thank you.
There's a lady here, the last one, because of gender. Sorry.
Okay. Please keep it short, very short. Sorry.
Yes.
We are running out of time.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the insightful keynote. I just noted that you began the keynote by speaking about the history of Africa and insisting on colonization. But I wonder, 60 years after colonization, none of the people who were in charge at that time are still in power, and the instruments have evolved. So is this still a relevant framework? Because there are also other scholars that are saying that we need to move away from decolonization as a framework to advance integration in Africa. And also, if we have to build a new narrative, are we going to build it from scratch? Or is it something that we can, look at by comparing with what other countries have done?
Thank you. That closes.
That's the final round, right? Okay, good questions. And I like the level of engagement that is coming out. Ashimizu? Oh, is that correct? Yeah, good. What sort of engagement should be done, particularly in the context of the network, in order to take advantage of private sector or engaging with the economists? My point was regarding the importance of engaging non-lawyers in the conversation. We saw the question of multidisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, to appreciate the perspectives, because as we all know, law by and large is a reactionary tool. We normally reflect and react to address issues which have already happened. Law can barely be proactive because, and much more so in the context of CFTA, where we have already have a framework, so we have got to address these issues. So the engagement with the private sector, these are the people on the ground. We normally philosophize, theorize about what we envisage to be the appropriate model of regulation. But who are the regulatees? They've got regulators and regulatees. Unless you come up with an appropriate recommendations which reflect the practical reality on the ground, we've got that term we use in law, then the law may potentially be repugnant in the sense that it comes to regulate, or it proposes interventions which are either aloof or detached from what exactly is happening. So my point was engaging with the private sector, at least we can appreciate the intricacies which are operating with them. And also law, in some respect, developed from the practice. We have got these customary practices, which later becomes law. So it's important we appreciate the other angles, the other camps, how they view these issues, how they view the engagement. Then our duty as lawyers will be to look at it from legal perspective. Then from legal point of view, what should be done? And then my thought is, if we do that, then we'll have a more balanced and a responsive approach. And more important, it will become multidisciplinary in terms of appreciating not only the way we look inwardly from the legal point of view, but also we appreciate from the economic perspectives, much more so as we talk about international economic law. So that will serve a purpose in terms of value addition, appreciating not necessarily the legal, but the practical aspect which informs the needed approaches. Question number 2 was on race. As you are raising a question, it reminded me, I recently read a book on a critical race theory. Critical race theory. That law can also be a subject of discrimination. Either, we say, by design, or it may just come as a consequence of applying a law. So whether it is pertinent to have a specific reference of race within the instrument of CFTA, particularly the Agenda 2063, I've got to check. All that I remember, there is a mention of gender. I'm not sure of race within the Agenda 2063, AU Agenda 2063. Whether that will be relevant to be mentioned, I might not have a direct answer, but when you talk about the critical race theory, it emphasizes the importance of being conscious of the racial ramifications of certain prescriptions, laws which are passed. So it's something which has already been debated, and I think there is a very growing jurisdiction, jurisprudence in the US regarding the critical race theory. The jurisprudence in the US is quite huge. We understand the context of the US. So it could be useful to have it there, but all that is important is to appreciate the nature of interventions which will be needed there, at least to appreciate how these racial divides affect inclusivity within the framework of CFTA. It's an aspect which has been discussed in other forums. I'm writing a paper, and that's why I came across with the critical race theory. I was looking at the gender and IP, whether IP is gender sensitive or not. Not necessarily looking at the express terminologies in IP, but the consequential effect of the laws, and particularly the the socioeconomic systems, where by nature in African setups you find certain gender, particularly women, are excluded, not by design, because of the social structure, to participate in innovative activities. And consequently, you find in the patent filings, you find few women as the patent holders. The same applies about race. There are studies which have been done in terms of who owns patents in the case of race. It's a subject which has attracted, I think, a discourse of its own. So in my view, there'll be no harm if that is included. In fact, it just expands the parameters and the platform through which these issues, which are mutedly addressed in some of the instrument, if it can be now explicit in the instrument. But I'll check in the Agenda 2063. I remember to have read something like that, that development should be done or facilitated irrespective of gender, race. There's that mentioned. Maybe we can bilaterally engage and check whether the AU Agenda 2063 features the race component. But it's an area which has been researched on, and you may wish to check the critical race theory and how the discourse and the narrative develop along that line. Quality assurance, harmonization in education, relinquishment of sovereignty. Yeah, I think we have these technical terminologies or jargon. Harmonization and approximation. You know better those who are dealing with the regional studies. And that's why in East Africa, we struggled a lot with harmonization. Then subtly, we moved to approximation. Appreciating that, anyway, these countries are different. So all that we want to approximate, it may come as closer as possible, subject to internal variations. If you insist on harmonization, I know in the international negotiations and dialogues, you may stifle, in some cases, the consultations. You allow a bit of flexibility for countries to feel that they are sovereign. There are issues which they can say no, issues which they can say yes. Then you agree on the broader framework that these are the minimum standards, where we may have variations in terms of quality assurance, but they should not vary alongside this established tenets. So you establish the pillar. And that has been an approach in many regional and continental markets, where they said we set minimum standards, countries are allowed to go above, they are not allowed to go below. So in the process, you may not achieve harmonization, rather you may achieve approximation. But it's a good thing to look into in terms of, I've already spent 5 minutes on to look at it in terms of harmonization or approximation. But the good maybe the best approach will be countries are jealous of their sovereignty. I've mentioned about OAPI, Francophone. They've agreed under OAPI. Say, okay, what you decide, we take it. But under ARIPO in IP, they said, no, ARIPO is just a conduit. Finally, national officers are the ones which will determine whether we accept the application or we refuse. So it's a question of looking at it from a more objective. Maybe go for approximation as opposed to harmonization by setting minimum standards which countries should comply. And in the process, you may come up with a more closely similar systems, which will be subject to minor variations, which are allowed within the framework. Then there was a discourse on variations, and then harmonization, how the discourse is now developed. What I said, how to develop the African narrative, we have got to appreciate that within Africa we have differences, cultural, economic, and matters of perspectives. So if we ignore that the variations are there and we just stick that we have to follow the same pattern of rules 100%, I think you are destined to fail. So we should allow variations in terms of countries may have some priority. You know, if you are meeting people outside Africa, you're coming from Tanzania, they said, how is Africa? Have you not come across such questions? Yeah? How do you do this in Africa? Let's say Africa is such a broad continent with these variations. So maybe the discourse should look at those common aspects which we share, common principles, common virtues that we share, and then progress along those in developing the discourse or the narrative which reflect the African context. The philosophies, why we should refer to their forefathers. You know, philosophy survives. We still cherish some of the ideas that they have. In fact, the founders of AU, and I'm speaking about Kwame Nkrumah, the idea of having single African government. These are the people who are prepared at that very beginning to say, okay, we should not have different independent territories. Or we may have what the federal states, then we have these, but we have at least a common institution which unite all these. But this was not done, and now it becomes very difficult. So how do we move from here? Do we start from the fresh? We have platforms to learn. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are areas which we can work out and coordinate and harmonize in order to move forward because we have lessons to learn. I picked some examples from EU, the challenges they had when they were trying to unite their markets and the difficulty they had, how they have surmounted. Our approach may also differ in a way because we have to contextualize African based on our legal systems and also cultural ramifications that are obtaining in Africa. So moving forward, we have got to appreciate what I've referred to in terms of OAU and AU. The fundamental ideas are still the same. Integration. But how we move with the integration matters a lot. And that's why I think Wilfred asked whether this is a curse or it's a blessing. It's all how we shape our approach in terms of integration. I'm not sure if I've satisfied you, but all that I can do is take these as lines for further research. Thank you.